Hi all. Today we're doing employment contracts and the labour market that you might encounter as an accountant or a self-employed business person. Um, Never mind the day-to-day experience in the workplace, which is most people's experience. As usual, we'll be doing the sort of elephant's eye and the ant's eye approach to the subject. And I'm going to start with some of the 2026 headlines um, that you might expect to see in a contract of employment. Leave. Full-time workers are entitled to 5.6 weeks, up to 28 days of paid holiday leave per year. That can include bank holidays. And of course, certain trades, it works slightly differently, particularly in the catering trade and so on. Sick pay in England, the minimum statutory sick pay is £116.75 per week for up to 28 weeks. And there's a handy gov.uk statutory sick pay calculator to estimate an employee's sick pay. Pension. In the UK, an employer must add all employees to their pension scheme unless the employee is below the age of 22 or above the state pension age, or does not earn at least £10,000 per year, or doesn't work in the UK. For employees that do not have to be automatically added to the pension scheme, the employer must still provide the option to join the pension scheme. So some people can say, no, not interested. And it's worth reflecting that 20 years ago, investment returns for pension schemes were very high, and you could count on reasonable returns, which attracted people into pensions. Returns have been muted by comparison in recent years, and that's had an effect on employee enthusiasm for pension provision. Notice, all good things come to an end, and the notice period in England, the statutory minimum notice of termination depends on how long an employee has worked for their employer. 1 week's notice after 1 month but before 2 years of employment. 1 week's notice for each year after that 2 years but before 12 years, and 12 weeks notice after 12 years. So if you come to the end, you can expect 12 weeks notice pay, and you have time to go and arrange alternative employment. On the other side of the coin, the statutory minimum notice of resignation is 1 week for employees who've been employed for at least a month. The national minimum living wage for workers aged 21 and over is £12.71 per hour this year. The statutory minimum wage rates vary across 4 distinct bands based on age and apprenticeship status. And these legal minimums are updated annually by the UK government. There's great enthusiasm for the minimum wage because when you come to labour market theory in particular, there's all sorts of factors going on in shaping the individual's supply curve for labour, let alone in the aggregate across 34.48 million people in employment. Currently, the employment rate is 75%, and the unemployment rate is 4.9%, being about 1.76 million of the 16 plus, age 16 year plus are unemployed. 9.1 million people aged 16 to 64 are classified as economically inactive, who don't have the opportunity to go into paid employment because they're caring for children, sick relatives, are themselves sick, and so on. And this all takes us into the interesting areas of the motivation for people to work. And the classic model is one of a trade-off between leisure time and earning a wage, earning the minimum that you need in order to sustain a household. But our economy, as it has matured to the point where 80% are service workers, is increasingly, in some aspects, monetarized leisure, in that people work in order to enjoy monetarized leisure. Clearly their holidays, overseas holidays, the gym subscription, that kind of thing. So as time has gone on, theory of labour markets has become more nuanced, and the topic has expanded extraordinarily, rightly so. For example, in the public arena, the issue of migration is an important one, and the issue of social segmentation of the labour, of those 34.48 million people, with a primary market which earn quite well and a secondary market where wages are lower, and wage differentials are always fascinating. So we come back to that national living wage for workers aged 21 and over. So now we're going to have a look. Now we're going to get our ant's eye out, and we will need a cup of coffee, because this is pretty dry stuff, employment contracts and employee handbooks. But it's well worth getting sorted out, well worth doing, and inevitably the accountants will help active business manage that aspect. The ACAS codes of practice set the minimum standards of fairness and reasonable behaviour that employers and workers must follow in the workplace. These codes are heavily relied on by UK employment law, and legal aspects of employment are increasingly important. For example, an elephant trap which some employers fall into is when consulting with the workforce about necessary changes as we go through the economic cycle or the life cycle of the business, is to discriminate. The natural instinct, perhaps, is to discriminate and perhaps look at more older employees as making way for younger employees. But that does not translate well into legal terms, and you can't discriminate on age. That's not accurate, not appropriate. So all employees are treated fairly and reasonably, ideally, and as long as that happens in practice, ACAS is avoided, the courts are avoided, and the business can just get on with profit maximizing, which is always the assumption that is the aim of business. Although again, labour market studies show there are fascinating social aspects to business, particularly when you look at the line between economic activity and non-economic activity, it's a fascinating one. So we go, our ACAS code that we're most concerned with concerns disciplinary and grievance procedures. Hopefully disciplinary is less of an issue these days with less physical work, more mental work, and it's more a question for HR of supporting people who might be stressed or whatever and not functioning in the workplace efficiently or as part of a team. Team working is far more significant than it was, and the ability, for example, to as well interact with AI is crucial. And 9.4% of job applications, it's estimated, require a significant AI appreciation, because for the simple reason that AI is increasingly seen as a member of the workforce. One clever friend described it as the best work colleague he had, because he could give it a task and it would go off and do it. So the human capital, the skills to succeed in the workplace as an employee or as a team leader of employees, it has changed and continues to change rapidly. In that context, we then, look at the minimum bits and pieces we can do to keep an even keel in the firm. And all employees must have a written statement. So the names of the employer and employee, the dates, start date when continuous employment begins, the pay, the rate and frequency of remuneration, so weekly or monthly, hours, work hours, overtime details and break times. Location, the place of work is crucial, or instructions if work is across multiple locations. Holiday and sickness, holiday entitlement, holiday pay and sick leave provisions, and notice periods. As I say, all good things come to an end, and increasingly with project working, an end is in mind, particularly if the employees are highly paid. It's expected that there is flexibility there, and again, studies increasingly focus on the flexibility of the workforce. The type of employment terms you encounter, you've got the express terms. So when you look at a contract, for example, as we would give to a student on work experience, it's a 14-page contract, and it contains the express terms. There are implied terms, and there's the minimum statutory rights. So a model written statement of employment particulars fulfills the employer's legal obligation under the Employment Rights Act 1996, and it's squarely there in Section 1. By law, this principal document must be provided to all employees and workers on or before the first day of work, and that's not a big ask, really. That statement can be little more than a single page, but then ideally followed by a contract. We've kind of described it in outline there. there are more detailed points which can follow on, and the place for those is in the contract, which can run to 14 pages. Quite often when you're taking on young people, training is a very important part of the role. And from the statutory viewpoint, disciplinary and grievance procedures just need to be there. And recourse tends to be had to the staff handbook. And the staff handbook tends to be a document which covers all the ground that needs to be covered. Equal opportunities policy, health and safety is terribly important. We work in the farming business, and it's an inherently hazardous environment, operating heavy machinery. Attendance at time off, disciplinary proceedings is in theory, it shouldn't arise, but of course the more people you employ, the more chance of something going awry happens. Then there's the workplace policy, and particularly IT usage and dress code. In our case, our dress code is sort of business casual, but you're expected to present a professional, clean and tidy appearance at all times when representing the company. The firm and the opinion, the good name of the firm is at the front of our minds when we are dealing with clients and dealing with one another in the team. And the staff handbook is acknowledged by the employee, receipt of it and signed, and that's an efficient way of dealing with these issues. So happy working, and I hope the waters are untroubled, and if they are, you've got the paperwork in place to make sure everyone knows where they stand and there's good communication. Cheers. Very good.